For most people, economic collapse looks sudden, chaotic, and unpredictable, something that seems to come out of nowhere after years of apparent stability. But history tells a very different story because collapses are rarely spontaneous events and are almost never caused by a single trigger. Instead, they follow recognizable patterns driven by leverage, dependency, capital flows, and strategic repositioning. Long before markets react, headlines appear, or politicians admit what is happening, and China's quiet movement of more than $8 trillion over the last 24 months fits this historical pattern with disturbing precision, not as routine financial management or diversification, but as a deliberate transition into a phase of economic conflict where outcomes are no longer political or ideological, but mathematical. This video is not about China winning or the West losing, and it is not framed around nationalism, politics, or propaganda, because those narratives are distractions that appear in every cycle and blind people to the real mechanics underneath. And instead, this is about pattern recognition, because when the same structure repeats across centuries, across empires, and across monetary systems, ignoring it does not make it disappear. It only ensures that those who recognize it early are positioned very differently from those who do not. To understand why China's $8 trillion repositioning matters, you must first understand that economic warfare does not begin with sanctions, tariffs, or military conflict, but with dependency. Because dependency creates leverage, and leverage creates control. And every major economic collapse in modern history has followed a four-stage pattern that begins quietly and ends violently. Not necessarily in war, but in financial restructuring, currency destruction, or systemic reset. Stage one always begins with integration, where two systems become deeply interconnected through trade, finance, supply chains, and capital flows. And during this phase, interdependence is celebrated as stability, efficiency, and peace, with the assumption that countries that rely on each other economically cannot afford conflict. Yet history shows the opposite, because interdependence does not prevent conflict. It delays it while magnifying the eventual damage. And this was true when Britain and Germany became deeply integrated before World War I, when the United States and Japan built supply chain dependency before World War II, and when Europe tied its energy infrastructure to Russia before the Ukraine conflict. Stage two follows naturally, and this is where asymmetry develops. Because integration is never equal for long, one side becomes more dependent than the other. One side controls choke points, whether in resources, finance, logistics, or settlement systems. And the other side grows complacent, mistaking efficiency for resilience. And this is where power quietly shifts, not through force, but through structure. For the past 3 decades, China operated within stages 1 and 2, integrating deeply into the Western-led global system, becoming the world's manufacturing engine, absorbing foreign capital, recycling trade surpluses into U.S. treasuries, and accumulating technological capability under the assumption that stability would persist model. Because integration without control leaves a nation exposed to external shocks, sanctions, and financial coercion. And the freezing of Russian reserves in 2022 was not just a geopolitical event, but a financial wake-up call for every non-Western power watching closely. From that moment forward, China's behavior shifted from participation to preparation, and this is where the $8 trillion matter. Because capital movements of that scale do not happen accidentally, and they do not occur without strategic intent, especially when they are distributed across gold accumulation, alternative trade settlement systems, Belt and Road financing adjustments, reduced exposure to Western sovereign debt, increased bilateral trade in yuan, and the quiet construction of parallel financial infrastructure designed to function when access to the dollar system is restricted, disrupted, or weaponized. This is stage 3, the most dangerous phase in the cycle, because it is the point where collapse becomes inevitable, not because someone chooses it, but because incentives, constraints, and leverage align in a way that makes reversal mathematically impossible. And stage 3 is defined by capital flight, disguised as optimization, by diversification that is actually decoupling, and by public calm, masking private urgency. In stage 3, official rhetoric emphasizes cooperation, stability, and reform, while behind the scenes, institutions reduce exposure, shorten duration, increase optionality, and prioritize sovereignty over yield. And this is exactly what China has been doing, quietly reducing U.S. Treasury holdings, increasing gold reserves at a pace not seen since the breakdown of Bretton Woods, expanding yuan-denominated trade agreements, and developing payment systems that bypass SWIFT, not to challenge the dollar symbolically, but to reduce dependency structurally. What makes this stage so misunderstood is that markets often continue rising during it, volatility remains contained, and mainstream analysis dismisses warnings as alarmism, because liquidity still flows and systems still function. But history shows that Stage 3 is not about immediate collapse. It is about positioning for the moment when confidence breaks. And confidence always breaks suddenly, not gradually, because trust is binary. It exists until it doesn't. The most dangerous misconception in modern finance is the belief that scale prevents collapse, that globalization makes breakdown impossible, and that central banks can always stabilize outcomes. But every empire believes this in its final phase, because scale increases fragility, not resilience. When systems are optimized for efficiency rather than redundancy, and when leverage replaces buffers, small shocks propagate into systemic failures. China's $8 trillion repositioning is not a bet on collapse tomorrow, but a hedge against collapse eventually. And that distinction matters, because those who move early do not need to be right on timing, only on direction, while those who wait for confirmation are forced to react under stress, at worse prices. But beneath the surface, the foundations are shifting, and when the final stage arrives, it will not begin with an announcement, a vote, or declaration, but with a failure somewhere in the system where trust, liquidity, and leverage intersect. And that brings us to stage 4. But to understand what controlled demolition actually looks like, you must first understand how stage 3 ends, why it always accelerates faster than expected, and why, by the time the crowd notices, positioning has already been completed. In part 2, we will break down the exact historical parallels from Britain versus Germany to America versus Japan to Europe versus Russia, and show precisely how China copied, refined, and modernized this playbook, and why the similarities are impossible to ignore. If this video helped you understand what's really happening, like the video and subscribe to the channel.